As the war in Ukraine rages on, new developments emerge that could shape the trajectory of the conflict and possibly end it. A peace plan, quietly drafted by US and Russian officials, is gaining traction, though its contents have stirred deep concern among European leaders and Ukrainian officials. The draft is not yet official, but it signals a shift in diplomatic strategies that could alter the fate of Ukraine, its sovereignty, and its relationships with the West. The US involvement in the peace process comes with high stakes, as President Donald Trump seeks to make an unprecedented diplomatic breakthrough. The plan, as reported, would involve sweeping concessions by Ukraine, including territorial losses and significant reductions in military capability. The US role in crafting such a deal raises questions about Washington's intentions and the potential consequences for Ukraine's future. In Kyiv, President Volodymyr Zelensky's government stands at a crossroads. Accept a deal that could end the war, but at the cost of losing territory and military autonomy, or continue fighting with no clear end in sight. The tension is palpable. In Moscow, President Vladimir Putin is watching closely, positioning Russia to gain ground diplomatically. Moscow's ambitions in Ukraine have shifted from outright conquest to creating a framework that cements its influence over Ukraine's political and military future. The draft plan's terms, if adopted, would reward Russia's territorial gains in Ukraine while presenting the West with a complex diplomatic puzzle to solve. Behind the scenes, the US and Russia have reportedly been negotiating the terms of a peace plan that would involve a comprehensive settlement. The framework, known as the 28-point draft, outlines the potential parameters for ending the war. The US side has been led by Steve Witkoff, a diplomatic envoy appointed by President Trump, while the Russian side has been represented by Kirill Dmitriev, a key figure within Russia's economic and diplomatic circles. The two sides have been in close contact, exchanging proposals and adjustments. The peace framework, still unofficial, includes major concessions by Ukraine. The draft reportedly demands that Ukraine cede parts of the Donbas region to Russia, effectively legitimizing Russian territorial control in the east. Ukraine would also be required to reduce its military size drastically and abandon certain long-range weapon systems. In return, Ukraine would receive vague security guarantees from the US and NATO, but the specifics of these guarantees remain unclear. Russia, meanwhile, would be granted formal recognition of its territorial gains and be allowed to exert greater influence over Ukraine's political and military decisions. In Kyiv, President Zelenskyy has made it clear that Ukraine's sovereignty is non-negotiable. He has repeatedly rejected any peace plan that would demand territorial concessions or undermine Ukraine's ability to defend itself. Ukrainian officials are particularly concerned about the proposal's implications for Ukraine's long-term security and its relationships with the West. European officials are also wary of a peace deal that could set a precedent for rewarding aggression, fearing it could embolden other authoritarian regimes to challenge the sovereignty of smaller nations. As news of the draft plan leaks, European leaders are increasingly alarmed. The peace negotiations, many believe, are happening without sufficient consultation with Ukraine or Europe. The foreign policy chief of the European Union has raised concerns about the lack of European involvement in the process, warning that the peace deal cannot be finalized without the full participation of both Ukraine and European countries. For Ukraine, the stakes are incredibly high. The Ukrainian people have fought tirelessly to defend their homeland, and any suggestion that they might be forced to surrender territory or military strength is seen as a betrayal. Ukrainians are united in their desire to retain their land, their military capabilities, and their ability to make decisions about their future. Any peace deal that does not preserve these fundamental aspects of Ukraine's sovereignty would face intense opposition from both the government and the people. Ukrainian officials have insisted that any peace settlement must be based on respect for Ukraine's territorial integrity and its right to defend itself. The country's military leaders have emphasized that the Ukrainian army is capable of continuing the fight and that peace should come on Ukraine's terms, not as a result of external pressure. In the face of mounting international pressure, Zelenskyy has vowed to hold firm to these principles. In Washington, President Trump's administration has faced criticism for its approach to the peace talks. Critics argue that the US should not be negotiating a deal that could undermine Ukraine's sovereignty, especially given the long-standing American commitment to supporting Ukraine in its struggle against Russian aggression. Some have questioned whether the US is more interested in ending the war quickly, regardless of the cost to Ukraine, than in ensuring a just and lasting peace. For Russia, the peace plan represents an opportunity to solidify its gains and establish long-term influence over Ukraine. Kremlin officials have long maintained that NATO's expansion and Ukraine's alignment with the West were central causes of the conflict. They have argued that a lasting peace in Ukraine cannot be achieved without addressing these issues. Moscow has made it clear that any peace agreement must take into account Russia's security concerns, particularly regarding NATO's presence on its borders. Russian President Putin has expressed his support for the peace talks, but he has also emphasized that the terms must include recognition of Russia's territorial control in eastern Ukraine and the formal acceptance of Russia's role in Ukraine's political future. According to Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov, any peace agreement must eliminate the root causes of the conflict, particularly NATO's expansion and Ukraine's NATO ambitions. Moscow's ultimate goal is to ensure that Ukraine remains firmly within its sphere of influence and that the West's influence in the region is limited. At the same time, Russia has sought to present itself as the guarantor of peace, positioning itself as a partner in stabilizing Ukraine and the broader European security environment. Russian officials have emphasized that peace cannot be achieved by ignoring Russia's legitimate security concerns, and they have warned that any settlement that disregards these concerns would be untenable. The draft peace plan, while still a work in progress, contains several key provisions that are likely to be central to the negotiations. These include territorial concessions. Ukraine would cede control of parts of the Donbas region to Russia, effectively formalizing the territorial changes that have taken place since 2014. The plan also reportedly calls for a recognition of Russian sovereignty over Crimea, a key point that Ukraine and much of the international community have rejected. Military reductions. Ukraine would agree to reduce the size of its military and dock, abandon certain long-range weapons systems, including those supplied by Western nations. The plan envisions a significant reduction in Ukraine's ability to project force beyond its borders. The draft proposes that Ukraine recognize the Russian language as an official language and grant official status to the Russian Orthodox Church within its borders. These provisions would give Russia considerable influence over Ukraine's cultural and political identity. In exchange for these concessions, Ukraine would receive security guarantees from the US and NATO. However, the specifics of these guarantees remain unclear, and it is uncertain whether they would be sufficient to deter further Russian aggression. Freezing the conflict rather than a complete restoration of Ukraine's territorial integrity, the plan seems to propose a freeze in the conflict along current front lines, with limited Ukrainian control over certain regions. This would leave Ukraine with a significantly diminished territory and military strength. These terms have raised alarm in Kyiv, where officials are concerned about the long-term consequences of such a deal. Many fear that the plan would leave Ukraine vulnerable to future Russian aggression, as well as to the broader geopolitical implications of losing territory and military capabilities. The push for peace comes at a time of immense human suffering. The war in Ukraine has resulted in the deaths of thousands, and millions have been displaced. The country's infrastructure has been decimated, and its economy has been pushed to the brink. With no clear end in sight, the Ukrainian government faces difficult choices about whether to continue the fight or accept a deal that could end the war, but at a significant cost. For the US, the desire to end the conflict quickly is motivated by both humanitarian concerns and strategic calculations. President Trump has made it clear that he believes the war has gone on too long and that a peace deal is necessary to prevent further loss of life. However, critics argue that a peace agreement that forces Ukraine to make significant concessions would be a hollow victory for Moscow and a defeat for Ukraine's sovereignty. As the peace plan continues to be refined, the next steps are uncertain. The draft is still in its early stages, and it remains unclear whether Ukraine will accept the terms outlined in the proposal. European leaders have called for a more inclusive process, warning that any deal must involve both Ukraine and the EU to ensure its legitimacy and long-term stability. The fate of Ukraine's territorial integrity remains at the heart of the debate. In Kyiv, Zelenskyy and his government face immense pressure to hold firm against territorial concessions, while in Moscow, Putin's government seeks to solidify Russia's gains and reassert its influence in the region. As the war enters its second year, the world waits to see whether peace is truly possible and if it can be achieved on terms that respect Ukraine's sovereignty and security.